Hello, everyone. I'm Sam Eckmann of Gold Derby. With me is Paul Machliss, the editor of Last Night in Soho, Edgar Wright's new film. And Paul, I'm thinking back to your last film with Edgar, Baby Driver. The editing that you did in that was so highly choreographed and structured. What lessons did you learn on that film that you sort of got to take with you over to Last Night in Soho?
Well, I think because it was the first time that Edgar and I had tried a film on that scale in terms of editing and integration of sound and music. We learned a lot. We learned a lot, of what to do. We learned a lot of what kind of not to do. But I think we took, the idea was that we took a lot of the things we learned and we liked and we realized were kind of successful in our approach and put them across into Soho. And it was like, how can we take these techniques not to do the same thing? We don't want to make a Last Night in Baby Driver kind of thing with the same kind of, very obvious editing techniques. Because I think, Baby Driver was a film that, wore its editing proudly on its sleeve. But how could we take some of the things we learned in terms of synchronization of light and music and sound, and maybe use it in a slightly more subtle way? Although maybe behind the scenes it was possibly just as intense as Baby Driver, but the end result looks much more relaxed, so to speak, I think is what our objective was.
Yeah, I'm sure. Well, let's stick with music and sound for a moment, because one of the things, about this film versus Baby Driver is, that film focused a lot on songs. Last Night in Soho has a much more room for the original score to play there. And what is the change there? What's the difference between having to edit along with new music, original music, versus, a standard pop song?
Well, like Baby Driver, Edgar had chosen a lot of the songs ahead of time. They were all there in the script. And like Baby Driver, we had to get a lot of that, in fact, almost all the tracks cleared before we started shooting because we were so dependent on those songs. But I think unlike Baby Driver, I think in terms of Steve Price, our composer, I think he was allowed much more freer rein to probably do, a score as, you and I would kind of understand it. I think Baby Driver, he did a fantastic job in kind of embellishing the songs that were already there and sort of writing cues that would get us from one song to another. And I think in this instance, there were ideas which were purely Steve's and in actual fact, in a more traditional sense, he did offer us up 5 or 6 basic demo cues. Once he'd seen some footage and some dailies, as we started the edit, he said, "Here, grab some of this." In fact, he actually had some tracks that I think we could even play in while we were shooting, just for atmos and feel for the actors. But then he came in with some fully fledged tracks that we could work on from the beginning of the edit. And in actual fact, it was quite interesting because normally when a composer gives you music, you tend to get kind of mixed stereo tracks, and that's that, and you work with that, and you can edit it, but you've got the finished mix. This time around, there were a couple of tracks where actually what he offered up were the multi-tracks, so we could actually load up kind of all 16 tracks of one of his cues, which meant that we had all the instrumentation separate, and I had all of it laid out on the Avid, which kind of mimicked his kind of Pro Tools layout. And what was interesting about that is we could start adding and taking out instrumentation from his cues, which is something we've never really had the ability to do. And in one instance, actually, we took what was a really strong, powerful bit of music that he'd done, and we just started almost like one by one, pulling every track out, just to kind of see, in that kind of less is more theory sometimes, depending on how you need to use underscore, what would happen if we just removed that instrumentation and that percussion and that string thing. And then we were left actually with one track, and it was one track which was a piano track, and it was really just there to kind of support this big Steve had written, but it was 3 notes. And, it just sounded so effective and so portentous and so shivery on its own. I think when I played it to Edgar, and Edgar said, I think we might have actually just found the kind of the theme and the motif for the film. So in actual fact, that's exactly how the film starts. When you start seeing the opening studio logos, that's what you hear, those 3 notes, which we kind of plucked out of this big cue. And of course, we gave that back to Steve. So Steve, we thought you did an amazing job, but these 3 piano notes, this really has something. And he said, great, love it, fantastic. And so he actually took that and then he re-recorded it and then made the cues as we kind of know them now. But that was a fascinating way of working, which I'd never done before in terms of in terms of using original music. So even that was a new concept for us.
Wow. And I would imagine one of the biggest puzzles for you, because one of the most fascinating visuals, I think, of the movie is the element where, Eloise has to sort of get sucked back and transition back into the 1960s from present day. So, there's so many moments where she starts in her bedroom, moves into the 60s, and her and Sandy almost become melded together. How did you approach those transitions?
Well, once again, it was one of the moments that we'd kind of animatic. Unlike Baby Driver, we didn't, we basically made a kind of a previs version of the whole film for Baby Driver. We didn't really have the time or indeed the requirement to do it on this one, but things like that needed to be worked out. Once again, with split-second timing, and so it was a combination of some drawings, I think by Edgar's brother Oscar, who did some sketches for us. We also had some choreography footage from Jennifer White, which I think Edgar shot, of Thomason just rehearsing the movements. And it was also a thing that we used that, along with Steve Price, Steve's partner in crime, Bradley Farmer, was fantastic at just helping us out on the detail. So he would actually take the song and, like on a printout, break it down to kind of chord, timing, duration, verse, chorus. And with all of that, you kind of knew that you wanted to be at this point at the end of verse 1 and at that point at the end of the first chorus. And you wanted to make sure that by the time, say Sandy walks down the stairs at the Café de Paris, there's a shot of, the young lady playing Cilla Black singing the very last line of the chorus, and you kind of work backwards. And so really it's just making sure too that once again, the advantage of being on set, as I was this time, as on Baby Driver, on set every day for Soho, was to be able to take those moments and make sure they fit the gaps, that they weren't too fast or too slow, because there were some sections where, you could say, okay, you've got this bit where, Sandy, Eloise first comes down, sees the mirror with Sandy, and then there's the kind of the switch around and all of that. And you kind of go, okay, well, that's sort of got to happen in about, 35 seconds. And so, Edgar's kind of concentrating on the perfect take and the shot and everything. And I'm kind of just keeping an eye on the time, basically, because of course I have the music running on one of the Avid tracks down there, which is kind of locked. So I can tweak the shots and the dialogue above it, and the music track is fixed. So I can see if we're going to hit that end beat, if we're going to be a second short or 2 seconds fast, and then we can adjust accordingly. And that was great, once again, to be able to give Edgar the feedback and go, yeah, it's really good. And, it's a little bit short. Maybe we do an extra little beat there or just extend that moment. And I think, it was those kind of, Baby Driver type techniques, but in a much subtler way. You can't really see on those kind of shots that, you're doing anything, because there isn't a lot of really punchy editing on the beat. But the editing is actually there helping to guide the whole process of the scene, as we're doing it.
Yeah, there's, if I'm remembering correctly, there is some sort of synchronized bits, especially like in her room, like timed to sort of like the neon sign outside that is constantly changing the mood in the room. Is that able to be figured out like on set while you're there?
Well, no, that was, yes, but that was one of those things where it actually kind of Edgar posed this question to the crew. It's like, how do we achieve this? What I'd like is, we have these repetitive neons, what I'd like them to do is to actually, doesn't matter what song or bit of music Eloise plays on her little record player, I'd like to make sure that the lighting is always in sync with the song. Plus, I'd like to predetermine the point where the lighting goes from blue, red, white to red, 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 because red, red, red is always the transition point when Eloise goes back in time. And to be honest, no one could quite work out how to do it. And then after a couple of discussions with the lighting team, it basically ended up that I stayed back late one night after wrap and kind of lined the music up with some linear time code on the Avid, and literally just cut images of full screen red, full screen white, and full screen blue. So I made up these kind of light maps, so to speak, about what's meant to happen and when, and the point where it goes to red, 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 red. And so I'd get these made, and then I was able to export out of the Avid a text file of the time code points, like an EDL, but it could be converted into an XML file, which could be read by the lighting panel computer. So then those guys could load that in, and then it would have all the on-off beats, and then they could just assign, because then I would give them a little quick time showing what color was when, with time code burn in that matched what they would have on their screen. So they could then program in the red, white, and blue, and the red, 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 exactly how I'd laid it out on the Avid. Now, the great thing about that is then when our music playback operator, Pete Blackshill, so he had all the tracks lined up on his Pro Tools system, and he would then have the same time code that I generated on the Avid. So when Edgar said, okay, I want to start this from the second line of the second verse, and I could go to Pete and go, okay, this is the endpoint here. If you just give us 4 pips in the run up to that as a cue for the actor. But then, of course, we would send that time code to the lighting desk. So as soon as Pete hit play, the lighting desk knew exactly where it was meant to be. So once we programmed it in the first time, it would always jump to where we needed to be. So there was no guessing, and we ended up doing that for every song that required individual lighting. So there was really just, and then of course, to make matters worse, because it's Edgar, he says, yeah, there's 4 or 5 of these songs that I'd like to shoot at 32 frames a second as well. So could you rejig that version at 32? You go, yep, of course we can. So I would get Bradley to resend me a kind of sync locked version of, say, You're My World, which is the song we used the first time Eloise transitions back to the 60s, but played 33% faster, but pitch corrected. So it didn't sound sped up. It sounded like the song being played a third faster. I would then put that into the Avid. I would then do the lighting map, which obviously would run a little bit quicker, feed that into the lighting desk, give that copy to Pete. And so it came down to the fact that Edgar would go, right, I want to do this in slow-mo. Right, what's the song? You're My World. I go, okay, right. So guys, we're doing You're My World 32. And it basically meant that Pete and the lighting team had all these sequences saved. So it didn't matter where we were on set, and even on location, actually, when we had to do some of the crane shots, the establishers with the neon, we would actually say, well, we need the same tempo as the song we're about to do. So we could even fly that in on location. Even if we didn't need the song, we could actually still have Pete playing the song to trigger the time code, to trigger the lighting desk, to make sure that all happened in sync. If it sounds crazy, it's because it was.
Wow. So just a tad, just a touch of preparation.
Oh yeah,
just saying.
Absolutely.
Yeah. The film, I mean, when you look sort of thinking about it behind the scenes, there is a lot of, complexity to it, even just with the tone. There's so much going on in terms of, there's the nostalgia of the 60s, there's, the horror elements that, how do you go to reference certain things for tone, like to pay homage for things, for, if you're working on a horror scene?
No, I mean, there's always things we look at. I mean, I know, Edgar and I mean, we made there was a thing where we deliberately thought, let's not kind of even just emulate our style of stuff. Because if you look at the start of, say, Scott Pilgrim, or the start of The World's End, or Baby Driver, they always open with a wham kind of scene, and immediately it's like it's an Edgar film. This, you'll notice, starts off in a very sedate fashion, and it takes a long time to build, and it's really more about atmosphere. And I think we chose this time, let's deliberately ease it off. Let's not make all the very obvious cuts and transitions that kind of are a hallmark of this style, although they are there certainly in places, but let's consciously try and do something a little bit different. And certainly because of the era we were referring to in the film, the mid-60s, Edgar was looking at films like Nick Roeg's Don't Look Now and Polanski's Repulsion, and even we would borrow from Kubrick with Shining and things like that, where we would kind of deliberately play things slower and gentler, and maybe we use a lot more zooms, because the big thing at that era was like the motorized zoom lens, which was the latest thing. Nowadays you tend to the movement, you get a much more when you track or use a Steadicam, you get a lot more kind of depth of movement when as the shot comes towards you. And I think there were moments where actually we sort of said, well, let's just try let's do a zoom here. Let's zoom into that scene and make it just feel like there's that old motorized zoom feeling, and that the creepiness actually comes in from borrowing a style from 30 to 40 years ago. We could do it in a more modern way, but I think to also bring out that atmosphere, and it's an atmosphere that doesn't need to kind of slam you over the head, although of course there are scenes, there are flashbacks which are pretty intense, and they've got some pretty manic cutting going on. I think we actually enjoyed playing with the dynamics of that a little bit more, and actually just having a lot more subtle scenes in between. So when those scenes do come up, they kind of are much more impactful than maybe if we worked that level all the way through, I think.
Well, then I should ask before I let you go, because a lot of editors that I've talked to have described their work to me as sort of invisible work. But it seems like you've, had the opposite happen too, where like Baby Driver, the editing is almost the star of the movie in a way. And this one has, there are synchronized sequences, but also much more subtle work. Do you have a preferred sort of way of working? Does it just depend on what the project presents?
I think it's, who you choose to work with and how you can best lend your talents to say the director whose project you're working on. I mean, there are jobs where I edit in a much more, traditional style, and the editing, like the old phrase, when an editor does their best work, nobody notices, because it's purely about helping to assist the storytelling and everything else. When you're doing a job for Edgar, that brings with it certain responsibilities, so to speak. He's going to lean upon your knowledge and talents a little bit more to try and go, okay, on this film, I'd like to try and attempt this. And that's the great thing. I think that's what always makes coming back to Edgar, a pleasure to work with, because he says, I've got this idea and I'd like to try and make it work. And it might be something that hasn't quite been done in that way before. But it's wonderful to have the those challenges come up across your career, that you can work on a more traditional, editing based film, and then you've got something here where it really taxes your expertise and you're required to be much more involved in it. I mean, I hope, like in Soho, the editing, the editing is there, and it obviously helps a lot to to get those ideas across. And as you say, with the synchronization, it's sometimes impossible to notice all those things working together. But I hope in Soho we've managed to kind of pull it back a little bit from Baby Driver, which, as you said, was just very intense, capital E editing, really, which I think a lot of people who don't normally notice editing would notice. And I think here we've used some similar techniques, but hopefully made it integrated it more, and brought in, with everyone else's incredible talents, because of course Edgar just surrounds himself with the most extraordinary people. And so I would like to say that editing is just a part in this instance of the whole that everyone's brought in to make, this film the success that I think it has. Because this idea, these concepts, they're so original and unique. And I think the fact that we all kind of push together to pull it off and make it work and realize those ideas and his vision. I think really in that respect is where I get a lot of the satisfaction from.
Yeah, well, it's a fantastic final product. Paul, thank you so much for sitting down with me. If you're out there watching, subscribe to Gold Derby. Keep in touch with us for the entire season. Paul, thanks once again. It was great to talk to you.
Thank you. You're very welcome. You're very welcome. Thank you.